Perfect. Okay. We discussed basic navigation. So these are just tips that you would typically use in an adventure race. Um, Ways to get around. A lot of them actually are common sense that you use in everyday life, but these are just reiterating tips for adventure racing and for navigators in adventure racing. Um, and then lastly, we'll close with some questions and answers. So if we jump into the overview, um, okay, well, what is adventure racing? Again, I think everyone on the call definitely knows this, but I'm just going to quickly run through it. It is orienteering, trek and mountain biking, and paddling. Those are the fundamental disciplines and legs. There's no order. There's no limit on the distance. You can cycle many times, trek many times, paddle many times. Those are all, joined together by transition points where you normally have access to a box a resupply box back before the race. And the whole while you're out there, you are searching for checkpoints, or often called control points, CPs, I guess it's easier to call it that, which looks something like this. It'll be a little board stuck up in a tree somewhere. It'll have some reflective tape on it. So if you do come across it at slightly darker hours or evening, that it'll hopefully reflect and you'll see it. And when you get up to it, it's going to have a big letter on it. It'll have whichever checkpoint it is, in this case CP12, and it'll have a big letter B. You'll have a corresponding passport that you got at the beginning, and you'll just simply mark for um, checkpoint 12 that it is the letter B. And you do this throughout the race. When you get to a transition, they'll check your passport and make sure you've got all the correct checkpoints, and then you continue racing. Transition areas are marked as TA on the map. And as I say, it's just you going from bike to trek, you're gonna get to a transition zone, you'll leave your bike there, you'll get into a resupply box, get your tracking shoes out, and off you go. Obviously, there's no hard and fast rules, but that's the gist of it. If we're talking about gear, um, okay, so what gear does a navigator need? Obviously, you need a magnetic compass, goes without saying, some highlighters, some fine liners, so that when you're marking your map, you can make any notes, highlight the checkpoints, highlight the route you want to make. You need a ruler for two reasons. One, to measure distances, and also to draw straight lines. You need a map bag or Ziploc bag. So map bags can be quite pricey. So often I just use a Ziploc bag. In fact, bags are my favorite, simply because if it gets a bit tatty or ugly, I can just toss it and get a new one. And I often carry a whole bunch of spares in my pocket. Um, and then on the bike, ideally you'd want some sort of a bike board. A bike board is just something that you can put your map on so that while you're cycling, you can look down and glance at your map and see where you are. For those of you that are doing your first race, a bike board is probably a bit of an investment. So there are some alternatives. Google it, take a look, and I'm sure you'll find something that'll suit you. Okay, let's take a look at the map. So every map you get will not all of them, depending on the race organizer, but a lot of the maps you get will have quite a lot of information on it. So um, in the top right-hand corner, can you guys see my mouse cursor, by the way, or not? If someone can just let me know if you can see my mouse cursor or not. Okay, cool, thank you. Okay, so in the top corner of the map, we can see the scale. For most of the races that you're going to do in South Africa, it's a 1 to 50,000 scale. What that means is 1 centimeter represents 500 meters. Therefore, every 2 centimeters represents a kilometer. It just so happens that the width of most people's thumbs, and this is something you can grab a ruler and actually go and measure your own thumb. Most people's thumbs is about 2 centimeters wide. So often, when you want to measure a course, you pull your thumb out and you measure along a certain road, and you can say, well, this is 5 thumbs wide, and therefore it is a 5 kilometer stretch. Towards the bottom of the map, we've got our sort of legend, which has a whole bunch of different descriptions on a lot of the features that we'll find on the map. There's normally an arrow indicating magnetic declination or magnetic north versus true north, and we'll get into some more detail on that later. Over and above the scale at the top corner, they'll generally include a sort of scale that shows you exactly how many meters, in relation to the map, a kilometer. So you can see, for example, each of these represents 1 kilometer. We'll get our contour interval. Okay, so this is a topographic map made up of contour lines, and each line represents a 20-meter change in elevation. And then often you'll find, and it's worth looking at the year that a map was made or published, when last it was updated. So this particular map is 2015. It's actually very recent. Sometimes you're using maps that are 15, 20 years old. And the older the map is, the more you need to prepare yourself to either find items on the map that are no longer there in reality, like windmills and reservoirs and things like that. And alternatively, there may be many roads that aren't on your map that are there in reality. So those are all just things to consider. If we take a closer look at the legend, again, I'm not going to get into too much detail. A lot of you can do your sort of research and homework on this. We've got a whole bunch of different types of roads. So your big arterial roads and national roads are going to be big, bold lines on the map. If you go down to sort of normal roads, they're normally just a white sort of line. Tracks and hiking trails. So a track can be a jeep track, and again, often a jeep track may no longer be there. It's represented as a dotted line. Dwellings and buildings are represented as dots. Ruins, police stations, schools. I mentioned windmills before. And then you've got sort of natural features. So you've got different boundary lines, perennial rivers. So if it's a solid blue line, it means it's generally a flowing river. If it's a dotted line, it's a non-perennial river, and most of the blue lines you see on a map are non-perennial, which means that you'll just find a riverbed, a dry riverbed. Um, but yeah, these are all things you can take a look at when you get your hands on the map. Most of the time, you don't need to reference this as you're navigating, but it's just the more you do it, the more you're going to recognize a lot of these things. Okay, so I mentioned contours earlier, and this is a very important aspect of navigation because you want to try and interpret what you're seeing in a 2D environment on your map into a 3D space. So contours essentially are lines that we draw on a map connecting points that have the same elevation in relation to the Earth. Okay. Um, so if you look at the different shapes I have on the right here, that's what it looks like if you were to look at it from a 2D perspective from above. And on the right-hand side, the dark sort of shapes is what it would look like if you're looking side on that particular element. Um, so how do we use these topo lines? So if you look at this fourth one here, for example, you'll notice that when the lines are really close together, that represents a really steep incline or a steep gradient. And when the lines are very far apart, it's a gentle slope. So this is a good example of steepness and gentle slopes. Now, why is that important? Because obviously, if we're going to choose a route to navigate, you want to try and avoid really steep terrain because it's not fun to go up or down. Of course, sometimes the route will take you through steep terrain, but that's something to consider. Um, and obviously, when you connect all these different topo lines, you get a bigger picture of valleys, reentrance, which is another name for a valley, a small valley, I guess, mountain ranges, ridges, etc., etc. One of the other features I just want to point out here is one that we call a saddle. And a saddle is when you'll find two sort of peaks. So this one over here, the third one's a good example of a saddle where you've got two little peaks and you've got a sort of depression in the middle. And that's what we call a saddle. So when you look at it side on, it looks like the saddle that you would put on a horse. And if you're crossing over a mountain range, you're generally going to aim for the saddle because it means the least amount of elevation gain. So those are the different topo lines. It's quite nice when you look at things like this to just try and visualize it in your head and understand what it may look like. And just to go out with a map and just practice. Look what it looks like on the map. Look what it looks like in reality. Um, cool. Here's just a little example of someone that went and laser cut some wood and actually took 2D topo lines, stuck them all together. So that gives you a very good idea of what a 2D space would look like if you had to move it into a 3D space. Okay, um, so here I've got a little topo map, and we're going to look and identify different geographic features. So as I mentioned first, we're looking for steep hills. So if you look where I've highlighted in yellow, there's a whole bunch of places where the contours are really close together, and that represents really steep um, gradients. Some of the blue ones I've highlighted here, you can see the contours are very far apart, and those are nice gentle gradients. So again, it's no wonder that this particular trail or jeep track follows the gentle gradient, because people, if you're driving in a car, you're not going to be driving up really steep hills. You're going to take the most gentle approach. Cliffs, if topo lines start touching one another, remember each topographic line represents a change in elevation of 20 meters. So if you start seeing lines touching each other, for example, here there's 3 lines touching each other, which means in a very, very short space, you've got a 60-meter change in elevation. So that's a very good example of a cliff. So if you see that on a map, it's probably worth avoiding, especially at night when you haven't got good visibility. Um, so maybe you're asking, well, how do I know if I look at this, if it's going in or coming out? Where are the peaks? Where are the valleys? Generally speaking, valleys always have rivers in them, or perennial rivers. As I mentioned earlier, you can see these are all dotted lines, the blue lines. But the peaks are generally represented by a number and a dot. So, so I'm just letting some more people in. Yeah, so peaks are represented with a little dot and a number. It's not always the case, but it's a good way to identify the peaks. And if you know where the peaks are, then obviously that's the parts coming out of the map. And generally speaking, when you see the rivers, those are the parts going into the map. Okay, then we talk about ridge lines or spurs. A lot of people use both these words sort of interchangeable. But ridge lines are essentially if you had to traverse the top of a mountain range, that's a ridge or a spur. And they generally have drop offs on both sides, and it's something that it often drops off in the third direction in front of you, but it's the top of a mountain range. Okay, valleys and or reentrance. Again, a valley is probably a really big one. A reentrance like a small valley. Um, those are represented by a lot of sort of depressions and small little non-perennial rivers that feed into big rivers. It's important to take notice of these, because as you navigating on the map, as you're looking on the map, as you're moving through the terrain, they're very noticeable features that you can use to try and update your position on the map. I mentioned saddles. I don't know if anyone can identify a saddle on the map. I could only find one when I was looking, and it's right over here. So if you set over there, you're spot on. Here you can see a little saddle. Again, you've got 2 little re-entrants, and if you were going to try cross from one side to the other, that would be the right place to do it. And then lastly, rivers, roads, and trails. Those are pretty straightforward. In the bottom left here, we've got a road represented by the white line that we looked at earlier. The rivers are all the little blue lines. Obviously, when people start and you think river crossing, sometimes the descriptions of a checkpoint will have the word river in it. Don't think flowing river. It's often anything but a flowing river. It's more often than not a dry riverbed. And the last thing to look at on the map is vegetation. And that's indicated by these sort of green areas over here. So depending on where you're racing, if you're going to be in the Free State, where there's everything's fynbos, then the choice of route that you might make depends on the vegetation you're going to move through. In the Eastern Cape, those people doing world champs, a lot of Eastern Cape bush is absolutely untraversable. It is thick and you can't get through it. So knowing where vegetation is definitely helps you later on with route selection. Okay, so those are some of the features of the map. Again, these are things that are easy to practice. Get a map, get out there, take a look at what you see on the map, take a look at the legend, take a look at the world around you, and just try and marry it all up. Next, we're going to turn our attention to the humble compass. Okay, so there's a few different parts of the compass. We have obviously the base plate, which normally has rulers on it. Sometimes it has a little magnifying glass. Don't be shy to use that magnifying glass. It's very useful if you're trying to identify little features. Um, It's got a direction of travel arrow. So some have got like a physical arrow, some just have a little triangle. It's normally at the top of the actual base plate. If we turn our attention further down, we've got our orienteering arrow, which is on the inside, or pivoting around the same point as the needle. That's called the shed. So often you'll hear about red in the shed. I've also heard people call it Fred. So Fred in the shed. So the shed is the orienteering arrow, and the magnetic sort of needle, and the red part of the magnetic needle, the part that points towards magnetic north, is called the red or the Fred. So later on, when you want to follow a bearing, the idea is to put red or Fred in the shed and then keep him there going in the direction of travel. I'll get into some more detail on that now. Lastly, we have the big sort of rotating bezel with a whole bunch of different degree markers on it. Don't get too worried about the degrees. It can get very technical. I'm not going to get technical. I'm going to keep it fairly basic when it comes to following a bearing. There are lots of videos out there if you want to find out more. Generally speaking, though, no one says get to checkpoint 4, then follow a bearing of 10 degrees or of 100 degrees. It's generally something where you're choosing if you want to follow a bearing or not. Okay, so magnetic declination. This often gets a little bit confusing to first timers, but it's actually so simple. So the Earth has a true north, so all our maps point to true north, but the actual magnetic poles of the planet just don't happen to. It's close to true north, but it's not exactly true north. And you'll be surprised it's more than you think. So in a place like Port Elizabeth, where we are, the magnetic declination is minus 29 degrees. So minus means that it's going in a westerly direction. If it was a plus 29, it'll be going in an easterly direction. Cape Town, for example, which isn't too far from PE, is minus 25. So as you're moving around from one race to the other, it's always a good idea to check what is the declination. Obviously, it's very often on the map that you're going to get, but there's a website I use, magneticdeclination.com, and go double check the declination of the area that you're racing. Okay, so let's take a bit of a look at it. So here we have our map. I've included the magnetic declination line from the sort of key or legend at the bottom. And now our map is facing true north. I'm going to introduce my compass. So here my compass is pointing to true north. It's facing straight up. And when I do that in a place like PE, you'll see that the needle is going to be pointing 29 degrees west, okay, to the left, minus 29 degrees. So it can get a bit confusing when you're trying to navigate. If you're trying to orientate your map so that you know where north is, and you're trying to, make sure your map is facing the right direction, that 29 degrees can throw you out by quite a bit. So how do we combat that? What are the ways to do it? Some compasses out there, and again, just take a look at the compass you have got a little screw that you can actually go and adjust the orienteering arrow, the shed, and you can actually adjust it for magnetic declination. So in this example, you can see that despite the fact my north lines are still pointing north, I've moved my shed to point to minus 29. So again, let's assume that most of you don't have that type of compass. What is the next best way to combat that? And that is to, when you get your maps and you're working with your maps, to take out your ruler, to line it up with the magnetic declination line on the map, and to physically go and draw declination lines on the map. So anytime you pull out your compass, you're going to line up the needle, you're going to line up red or Fred with the magnetic declination lines. It's also important that you put directional arrows on it, because if you fold your map up and you see a whole bunch of lines, you don't want to accidentally be navigating in 180 degrees the wrong way. You're going, south when you should be going north. So it's a great way to actually mark the map, so that every time you pull out your compass, you're just putting your needle in the same direction of your declination lines, and off you go. Let's talk about a real world example. So here we go, same sort of map. Assume that we're here at the top of this hill, 10-stop hill at 5:06, and we're making our way down towards this river. And as I'm busy making my way down, along this yellow or the highlighted path, we get to this fork. Okay, so if you are navigating now, you're facing the direction that you want to travel. Do you go left or do you go right? You look at your map, you don't see any forks on your map, and this is typical. Often there'll be a single line on your map. Do you go left or do you go right? It's probably a good idea to pull out your compass. So in this particular example, I pull out my compass and you can see my magnetic needle is pointing it's almost pointing like 160 degrees. Okay. What that means is that my map is not orientated in relation to my surroundings. So what I want is my map needs to be facing the same direction as the world around me. Because then when I look at the map, if I'm looking at certain features, if I'm trying to see the river, in this example, I'm coming down this path. So technically the river should be on my right hand side. But obviously the map's not oriented correctly, so it looks like it's going to be on the left hand side. So to orientate your map, you're going to turn your map until your declination lines line up with your magnetic needle. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to turn my map. You see the needle staying straight. It keeps pointing to magnetic north, and I'm going to keep turning it until that needle lines up perfectly with my declination line. Now, what that means is that my map is orientated in the same way that I'm standing in the real world looking at different paths to choose from. Okay, so I mentioned we were at the top of or 10-stop hill and we were coming down this path. So if I take a look there now, you can see that the path that we want to be on is going in a southwesterly direction. At no point is it going southeast. So if I had the choice between the path going on the left or the path going on the right, I would choose the path on the right because looking at my map, which is now correctly orientated, I need to be going in a right direction, in a southwesterly direction, and therefore I'm going to choose the path on the right. So that is orientating your map. So that's probably one of the most important things or important purposes of your compass is to make sure that you can orientate your map correctly so that when you're looking at the map in relation to the world around you, everything's facing the correct direction. The other major reason why we use compasses is to follow a bearing. So this can get very technical, as I mentioned. I'm going to try to keep it simple. In this example, obviously, I'm illustrating it the way you would hold a cell phone in front of you, but you're always holding your compass parallel to the ground. You're holding it flat. So in this example, we're on the top of a hill, and you can see the sun setting. There's no moon tonight, so the moment the sun goes, I'm not going to have so if I said we were navigating to this little peak over here, that'd be pretty simple during the day. You probably don't even need your compass. You can leave it in your pocket and you can just stroll along until you find that particular peak. But when there's no features on the earth, in other words, it's a featureless terrain, or it's dark or you have low visibility or there's lots of trees and you can't really see where you're going, then it's a good idea to kind of check your direction of travel and to follow a bearing. So what you're going to do, again, you're going to pull out your compass. Again, you're not holding it like a cell phone, you're holding it flat. So just imagine this is flat. So you're looking down in your hand and you're looking up and you're seeing the picture. We can see that my needle's pointing in a certain direction. Don't worry too much about that. What I want to do is I want to take my compass and I want to point it in the direction of travel. So again, my direction of travel is this line at the top here. Where do I want to go? So I'm going to turn my compass to the direction I want to go in. Again, don't judge this too harshly. I'm just trying to illustrate that we're going towards that peak over there. Okay, so how do I stay on that course? What you now do, or what you then do, is you're going to turn the bezel on your compass to put red in the shed. Okay, so I'm going to turn the compass bezel, putting red in the shed. So now, when I hold my compass, okay, I haven't even used my map here. I'm just using my compass. If I walk and I keep that magnetic needle in the red arrow in the shed, I will be walking along a particular bearing to my objective. Don't get too worried about the numbers. You very seldom actually look at the numbers, but the idea is that you can then hold your compass and walk looking at your compass, following a certain direction. You don't often take a bearing and follow it directly. More often than not, you're using other features as handrails, which we're going to get into, and other features to orientate where you're going and to help navigate you to where you want to go. But there are occasions where the landscape is featureless, or it's dark, or you have low visibility, where you have to be able to pull out your compass, put red in the shed, and follow a direction. Okay, if you're doing the same thing with a map, so for example, I'm standing at CP11, which is a trig beacon at the top of a mountain over here, and I want to go to CP12 in that direction. Same thing here. So this is, I'm now looking at the map. I'm not looking at the real world. I'm going to pull out my compass, okay, and I'm going to, looking at my compass, I'm going to um, point in the direction that I want to travel in. So I'm going to rotate the compass to where I want to go. So now my direction of travel is between CP11 and CP12. And then the same thing, I'm going to move my bezel to put red in the shed. And now if I fold my map up and I keep my compass out and I keep red in the shed, I'm going to be moving in the correct direction to get from CP11 to CP12. Again, in this example I've chosen, you can see there aren't many features. Yes, there's a few dams you're going to pass. There's a little reservoir over here. But apart from that, it's very, very featureless. And even where the checkpoint is, there's no easy features to identify to get there. So don't get too worried about this. If this is a bit confusing, again, there's lots of different tutorials out there. Feel free to contact me on a one-on-one basis, and I can try to talk you through it. And for those in the PE area, I'm happy to go out with you with the compass, with the maps. We can go to the valley one day, and we can just play around with some of these concepts. Don't worry about this too much. You don't use it all that often because luckily we've got many features that we can use for navigation. Okay, so before we get to navigation, let's talk about map marking. So, as the navigator, part of your responsibility when you get to a race is to work the maps, to choose a route. So, when race briefing happens, often you're going to get your first map handed to you. You'll also get other maps during the race. So, you need to make sure that during the race you're carrying some of your highlighters. Or some of your fine liners with you. If you don't want to carry them, you can leave them in your transition box. You're always going to get maps in a transition area. Um, when you get your map, it's going to look very much like this one does now. It's completely blank. Okay. Um, there'll be a master map somewhere, and on the master map somewhere, that the race director would go and mark or highlight CPs, checkpoints. Okay. You need to go and mark those checkpoints from the master map onto your map as accurately as possible. So bring a headlight. Often it's the lighting isn't very good. Double, triple check where exactly is it. So I'm just going to put some CPs in here. So yeah, I've got a start down at the bottom here. We've got a CP1 on a road. It looks like it's crossing a little bit of a non-perennial river. We've got CP2, which looks like the peak of a little mountain. And then we've got TA1 or transition area 1, which looks like the edge of the Grondal Dam. Okay. When you're marking down the CPs, a lot of times on the side of the map, they'll indicate how many checkpoints there are. Make sure you get all the checkpoints. Make sure you have a teammate with you, because it's happened to me before where you're rushing, you're racing, and you miss a checkpoint, and then when you're out there, you realize, oh my goodness, I don't have CP2, and now what do you do? It's impossible to find. You might be able to find another team who'll be kind enough to give it to you, but it's your responsibility to make sure you get all the CPs. So make sure that you sit with your teammates, that they double check you get all the CPs. Okay, once you've got the CPs marked, if it's not too much commotion, because often around the master maps there's a lot of commotion and people, you can go find a quiet spot, and now you can start working your map. So the first thing you probably want to do is pull out your ruler, line it up with magnetic north, and go ahead and draw your declination lines. Super valuable for later, brilliant. Depending on the race, some races, if the navigation is quite simple and there's big handrails, I know I've used that word a few times, I'm going to get into what that is. then you don't always need, where you think you don't need the compass as much and you're racing, you don't need to do it. But if you've got the time, put the declination lines and you're never going to regret doing it. The next thing you need to do is now identify what route do you want to take to get between the checkpoints. So now we spoke about the contours and we spoke about some of the different features on the map, and that's largely helps us determine what route to take. Often on the bicycle, it's just connecting the dots in terms of which roads to take. But when you're on foot, you're not very often you're not following roads. You're taking direct lines. You're walking through the mountains. You're walking, across vegetation. So it's important to be able to understand how you want to pick your route. So in this particular example, again, I've got to start. I can see CP1 is at the top of a track, jeep track or path, and I can see that the vegetation and the topographic sort of contour lines around it look pretty squiggly. Squiggly means hilly, so it makes the most sense for us to follow this path all the way up till we get to checkpoint 1. Okay, now we're at checkpoint 1, we need to get to checkpoint 2. So let's take a closer look at that quickly. So if I'm at checkpoint 1, what's the best way to get to checkpoint 2? Um, so again, everyone will have different opinions. You can drop into this valley and follow these sort of non-perennial rivers and come up in the saddle and come this way. But generally speaking, I wouldn't want to lose too much elevation, only to have to gain it again. So the less up and down I can do, the better. We all know when you're on a bicycle, the flatter it is, the easier it is. So I'm probably going to look for the most gentlest approach. So for me, I'd probably follow this road a bit more, looking at the landscape around me. I'd follow the top of this ridge line down through the saddle and up to the peak where I'd find checkpoint 2. Then to get to the transition zone, I can see again there's a lot of really steep sections here. We identified there might be a cliff over here. I definitely don't want to go down there. So I'd probably follow the top of this mountain and come down where the contours are nice and wide and slowly make my way to the transition zone. Okay, so once you've identified what route you want to take, you're going to pull out your highlighter and you're going to highlight your route. When you're on a foot section, you're going quite slow, so you don't always have to highlight it. But on a bike section, where you only glance into your map every now and then and you are still cycling and you don't want to obviously crash on your bike, it's a good idea to highlight the route so when you look down, you can quickly identify where you are. So that's map marking, and that's quite an important aspect of it. Okay, if you still have time after that, uh, every checkpoint has a description, and often writing the description on your map, so while you're navigating, you can call it out to your friends, for your own reference, is always helpful. So the description for CP1 is small bridge, which means as you're getting closer to that, it's easy to understand where to look for it. And CP2, top of hill, not very creative. You'll find many of the descriptions are often not very creative. Okie dokes. Now we're going to get into some basic sort of navigation and some of the tools that you need to stay on course. So put your head in the map. So the best thing about navigating requires two things: knowing where you are and knowing where you want to go. Now, where you are when you're at a checkpoint or where you're at a start, finish, or in a transition is obviously very easy. As you start moving between checkpoints, it's important that you try and constantly update where you are on the map. Okay, so how do you do that? You can do it by trying to judge your pace over a certain terrain. So if you believe you're going at 10 minutes a K and you've been walking for 20 minutes rather, then you can try and update where you believe you're on the map by 2 kilometers. There's a lot of different features on the map, and it's called collecting features. So the more features you collect as you start moving along a particular path, you can use those features to update that you know where you are on the map. It's often called thumbing the map, where you hold it. Um, you literally on the map, you're going to put your thumb where you believe you are, and as you believe you've walked 500 meters a kilometer, you're going to take your thumb, you're going to move it along the map, and you're constantly holding the map where you're with your thumb on where you believe you are. So if we are navigating along this sort of path from CP1 to CP2, in this case, again, this looks highly vegetated, so we're going to follow the road down. We're going to go past these black dots, which are dwellings or buildings. We're going to come across this sort of marshy land here and try and get to CP2. What are the features that we would use and identify as we go along? So that's the path we're going to take. What are the features? As we start moving along it as a team, I'm going to say, guys, we're going to be going downhill, but then we're going to make almost 180-degree turn. So that's the first very clear feature that I'd be looking for. And when we make a 180-degree turn on the map, I'm going to update it or on the road rather. I'm going to update where I am on the map. So what you're essentially looking for, the features we're looking for, are things that are easy to identify in the real world, as well as identifiable on the map. Okay, so now we've turned around there and we're carrying on. What's the next big feature? I can see there's a whole bunch of non-perennial rivers that are all crossing our path. So I'd be keeping an eye out for that, saying, guys, it looks like we're going to be crossing 3 rivers. Okay, maybe it could be flowing, maybe not, but I definitely say it. So trying to keep my teammates engaged. As we've gone further than that, I can see there's a join in the road or in the trail. So I might say, hey, we should be getting up to. So if I've crossed the river, I'm going to try to judge how far are we to the next feature. Just call it a kilometer, for example. In a kilometer's time, we should see a T junction, and we're going to carry on the right-hand side. So those are all collecting features. And as you're moving along, your compass can stay in your pocket, because as you're collecting those features, as the map makes sense, as you're looking at the world around you, you'll often be able to navigate through it. So these are the skills we use every single day to navigate ourselves when we drive, when we walk. This is intuitive to more people than others. I will admit that. As we go further down, there's some dwellings here or some buildings. Super easy to identify. Um, if we go further than that, there's obviously a marshy section, and from there you want to now try to find the next checkpoint. So that's what we call collecting features. So as you're moving along, you're keeping your head in the map. Don't look at your map every half an hour and stick it in your pocket. Keep that map in front of you. Look at it all the time. The more you're looking at it, the more you're updating where you are on the map, the less likely you are to find yourself completely off course because you think you know where you are. Meanwhile, you took a turn that you didn't realize you took, and now you're struggling to figure out where you are. Okay, I've mentioned handrails a number of times. So what's a handrail? So here's an example of a beach section just north of St. Francis Bay, and I'm navigating from CP3 to CP4. And here is the massive handrail is the ocean. You don't need your compass to orientate your map. You just take your map out, and you can literally see the ocean's going to be on your right-hand side. If you're holding the map and the ocean's on your left-hand side, you're holding your map wrong. You're going to turn that map so that the ocean's on your right-hand side, matching the direction that you're going in. And that's what we call a handrail. So a handrail is any feature that you either traversing along, like a valley, a mountain range, anything that runs parallel to you, to where you are, is what we would call a handrail. Just like when you go down a flight of stairs, you're going to use that to navigate and to direct you to where you want to go. Easy things to look at. Of course, when it gets darker, when it's nighttime, when it's low visibility, then it's harder to see all these different features. And that's when your compass becomes more and more important. If you navigate into a place like CP4, a river, so we're looking for a non-perennial river coming out into the ocean, that's always easy to find. Maybe there's been a big spring tide and it's washed all the sand up. There's no trace of a river. It's not flowing. It hasn't rained recently. So it's easy to walk past that. So then we look at our next navigational sort of item, and that is called a backstop. So a backstop is some sort of feature on the map that I can identify and tell my teammates about, that if we get to this backstop, we've gone too far. So you can see this stretch of beach is largely rockless. Here I can see there's some rocks. I can obviously see there's a whole bunch of houses or dwellings and roads. So we find ourselves walking along the beach and I start seeing some houses and I start seeing some rocks, chances are we've gone too far. So whenever you shooting for a checkpoint, it's always a good idea to try and identify a backstop, something that again very easy to find in the real world, very easy to find on the map. So that should you get to it, guys, we've made a mistake. We need to turn around and go back. Okay. So I know I'm going quite quickly. I'm trying to obviously cover quite a lot of information, but we spoke about navigating on a bearing. And one of the elements that we use for that, or we use in conjunction with that, is what we call an attack point. So let's, for the case of, or sake of this example, we can assume we're at checkpoint 6. Again, it's the top of a little mountain, and we want to get to checkpoint 7. Now you can see checkpoint 7 again, it's fairly featureless on our map, wherever it may be. So I can try shoot directly for it. But between CP6 and CP7, I can see two little valleys, two reentrants. There's a number of different contours. I'm going to be dropping some elevation. I'm going to be gaining some elevation. And, although I've got the backstop here of the next sort of reentrant, I don't really want to overshoot it. The more accurately I can try and get to a checkpoint, the better. So if you are trying to navigate to CP7, you might want to use what we call an attack point. An attack point, just like a backstop, is a recognizable feature close to the checkpoint that we can navigate to quickly and easily, and then from there really put our head in the map, pull out our compass, take a bearing, navigate on a bearing to make sure that we get to the particular checkpoint as accurately as possible. So in this particular example, if you look at this little kink in the road just below CP7, um, that would be a logical attack point for me. So if I was at CP6, I can drop down without losing too much elevation, climb a little bit, following a path or a road. And when I get to this major kink in the road, again, I should easily be able to identify that. I would say, okay, great. Now I know for certain where I am. From here, I'm going to pull out my compass, look at my direction of travel that I want to move into, find CP7 on my map. Or maybe if there's a feature that I can see when I'm standing there, when I pull out my compass, again, orientating myself, I can then say, guys, you see that big tree over there, for example, that we're going in that direction. But at the end of the day, you want to be able to pull out your compass from your attack point and then attack the CP. So instead of trying to attack it from CP6, where there's a lot of room for error, if you're off by 1 or 2 degrees at CP6, by the time you get to CP7, 2, 3 kilometers later, you've probably missed it by 100 meters, 200 meters. Remember, you're looking for a little board with reflective tape on it and a letter. So it's not like you lost. You just want to make sure you're as accurate as possible. Okay, together with attack points, another strategy we use is called aiming off. So from CP7 to CP8, again, I want to drop down till I hit the sort of main non-perennial river over here, and I want to collect the checkpoint. Okay, so if I decided I'm going to try drop back on this road and shoot straight down to CP8, I might very well get it. I might get lucky, but the problem is I might hit it and then think to myself, okay, we need to go downriver because we haven't found the checkpoint. We're on the river, so let's start moving down until we find it. And you may have just missed it. You may have just landed down from where the checkpoint is. And what lands up happening is you're going to go all the way down this river until eventually you get to some sort of backstop, and you're going to realize, oh, we've missed it. And you have to go all the way back the way you came, looking for the checkpoint. So rather than trying to aim for it directly, okay, you're going to aim off. So essentially, you're aiming for a handrail. In this case, it's a valley. So you know when you hit the valley, you've hit the handrail. But instead of aiming directly for the CP, you're going to intentionally aim up or down, left or right, east or west, north, south of the checkpoint you're trying to hit. And then when you hit your handrail, you know for certain we do not go upriver in this example. We need to go downriver. And then you'd move down and you'd find CP8. So it might be a little bit further in the short run, but you're guaranteed to get it, or not guaranteed, you're more likely to get it first time. Okay, so that is aiming off. All of these things and navigation when you're on foot, it involve estimating distance. So if we look at some of these different maps, there's different ways that you might choose to estimate distance. So if I was moving from CP3 to CP4 on a fairly featureless beach, How would I know when I get to CP4? Remember, you're not allowed a GPS watch. You can't just say, okay, well, in 5 kilometers, we're going to find the CP4 and just, okay, well, we're on whatever, 10 kilometers now, so at 15, we're going to look. You don't have the GPS, so you need to try and estimate your distance. So some people use pace counting, where they literally count their steps, and they in training they've gone and measured roughly how many steps they take in a kilometer, in 500 meters, in 100 meters. Obviously, that's quite an extreme way of doing things, and you don't use it often. But if you're trying to find a checkpoint from a bearing on a compass in a dune field, for example, where again it's featureless, the map just shows brown nothingness, then you want to say, okay, great, we need to go for 700 meters, and then you may use a tactic like that. If you're going a longer distance, you can often time yourself. So again, if you're moving at what you believe to be, and this is the difficult part, and this is where training, blindly, don't look at your watch the whole time. So if you're walking along, say to the people you're training with, how fast do you think we're going? If you're running along, okay, well, I feel we're running at 7 minutes. Okay, how fast are we actually going? Oh, we were doing 6 minutes. Okay, or if you're walking on a trail, um, how fast do you think we're moving on this trail? 10 minutes, okay. Then check your pace and just try and get a sense for how long it takes you to cover certain terrain. When you're going uphill, try and figure out how long it takes when you guys or your team are moving up a hill, when you're moving down a hill. Um, and then given the distance you need to cover, we need to cover 4 kilometers. We're moving at 15 minutes a kilometer. Therefore, in an hour's time, you should be getting to a checkpoint. So it's a tactic that everyone uses. It's one of the easiest ones. And in terms of team dynamics, it's generally you want to try to keep everyone engaged. So it's a duty that wouldn't necessarily fall on the navigator. It would fall on your teammates to try to keep them involved. You'd say, okay, Helen, one of my teammates, Helen, what's the time now? Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Okay, we need to do 4 kilometers. We're going at about 10 minutes, okay, at 22. Let me know, and then we're going to double check where we are. The whole while, the navigator's keeping his head in the map, collecting features, and together with those multiple different mechanisms, you're hopefully going to find your checkpoint or your turnoffs or your roads as accurately as possible. Okay, then the last item, bearings and triangulation. We covered bearings earlier on. Triangulation, I don't want to get into too much detail, but I will describe it, is basically the determining where you are by finding 2 points on the map or in the real world and on the map that you can see. And basically what you do is you measure a bearing to each of those items. You draw a line back to wherever you are. Again, if you're on a road or a trail or a very distinct handrail, if you draw a line from that particular object or feature along a bearing twice, you're going to get where they cross, and that's generally going to be where you are. Again, don't worry too much about triangulation. It's not a skill you need to master. But if you want to do a little bit more advanced, you want to play around with it a bit more, then go take a look at triangulation. Okay. Sorry, we did this one already. Okay, resources out there. So there's lots of different resources out there. Lots of different videos on YouTube. And, I think we're trying to get a lot more active adventure racing community together so that we can all support each other, help each other, and get each other to the finish line. So this is one of my particularly favorite resources is AR on AR. It's a guy called Adam Rose, and he has a YouTube channel where Adam Rose, the red AR, talks about AR adventure racing. And these are just some of his videos that I thought I'd highlight for some of the people that might be new to the sport. Magnetic declination, how to use a compass, what gear do I need for my first race. Obviously, please understand that his videos are probably geared more towards the longer distances, so don't get freaked out if he starts talking about fairly extreme things. If you're doing a shorter distance, 100 k's and below, you don't need to stress about all these advanced concepts, but it is interesting to immerse yourself in the world of adventure racing learn from other people's experiences, learn from a lot of their tactics. Cool. Feels like I've been talking forever. So those are the sort of that's the introduction to navigation. So those are all the little points that you kind of need to work on. Um, Tips for adventure racing, tips for navigation. I think I mentioned it a few times. Include your team. Don't just be walking through the bush, you holding a map, holding a compass, and then randomly turn right onto a path and off you go. Your teammates, if you're out there for a long time, they start getting a bit bored. Their brains start getting a bit, start wandering. The more you can include them in the navigation, the better. So if you know you're going to be crossing a river, hey guys, we should be crossing a river in roughly 500 meters. It gives them something to look for. And if you don't notice a feature, remember you as the navigator, you're trying to collect these features. Your teammates can say, "Oh, I think we just crossed a little riverbed," and you go, "Oh, we did cross a riverbed," and you can identify and highlight that on the map. Um, if you start getting into the later hours, your team, as I mentioned, starts getting tired, and it keeps them included, it keeps them involved, and it makes them part of the navigation, which is great. It also means that should you get to a tricky navigation spot, that if other people have been engaging with you the entire time, they're more likely to be able to help you in a tricky situation rather than not being able to give you any input. So if you said, geez, we should have crossed 3 rivers to get to where we are now, then someone might say, but we did actually cross three. I remember there was one little small one, but I remember it came down the mountain like this. So if you constantly engaging, they're going to give you information you can use. Okay, don't be crippled by indecision. This is another big one. I call it paralysis by analysis, where when navigation gets tough, it's you might move 400 meters, then you stop and you look at your compass and you look at your map, and then you go another 200 meters, you stop and you look at your compass, you look at your map, trying to find out where you are. Obviously, this is a situation where you may be a little bit lost. You might not be sure exactly where you are on the map, and you don't know what to do. So you're constantly trying to get more input, but that input doesn't often come. It's happened to me many a time, and the trick is that the more you're moving through the terrain, the more likely you are to get more features that'll help actually identify where you are on the map. It's not always like that. I'm not saying blast off trying to collect features so you know where you are, but don't be crippled by indecision. Try your best and don't be afraid to make mistakes. At the end of the day, your intention as the navigator is not to get anyone lost, and your teammates need to understand that. It's easy to make mistakes. We use the word lost. Very seldom do you get so lost that you don't know where you are. But obviously, this is a game or a race where you're trying to find checkpoints or control points. So the more accurately you can find those, um, the better you're going to do. So you might know exactly where you are, maybe not exactly on the maps. It's not like you're lost in the wilderness and you need to get rescued, but the more accurately you know where you are on the map, the quicker you're going to find those checkpoints. This is a big one. Try not to get distracted by other teams. So it's difficult because if you want to put self doubt in yourself, if you see one team going off in that direction and you believe you need to go off in this direction, you're essentially saying that person's wrong. Um, and you need to be confident enough to stick to your own decisions. It's not easy. When you see other teams stop and start searching for a checkpoint, and you think, "Oh, I'm sure it's a little bit further on." Often you'll think or you out of fear of missing a checkpoint because maybe you've got it wrong, you may start searching for a checkpoint too early. Trust yourself, back yourself. Try not to get distracted by other teams. One of the things I dislike is when there's lots of teams around us because I do get distracted by other teams. It's natural, um, but if when we're alone, I'm not worried about other teams. And my head's in the map, my head's in the features, and it definitely leads to a better sort of navigational environment for the team. If you're not the navigator, support your navigator. The best thing for team morale is good navigation. It's quite simple. The worst thing for team morale, bad navigation when you're getting lost. With that said, if your navigator is trying his best and he's navigating out loud and he's engaging the team and he happens to get a bit lost, don't crucify the guy. It's not gonna make him better. It's not gonna repair any of his mistakes. So support your navigator, help your navigator. Um, Make sure as a team you stick together. And then for navigators, there's another big one: forgive yourself. You are going to get lost. You're going to make small, um, um, what's the correct word? Mistakes, small mistakes in navigation, where you're going to think you're going to go this way. You might overshoot something. You might go down a path thinking this is the right path, but as you go down it, and you maybe look at your compass, you look at your map, you say, "Oh, this doesn't feel right. We need to go back up that hill that we've just been walking down for the last 10 minutes." Which means you've gone 10 minutes downhill, maybe 15 minutes to get back to the top of that hill, 25 minutes have been wasted. You know, Forgive yourself. You're not trying to lead your team astray. You're trying your best. Um, so if you do make a mistake, don't worry, don't harp on that. Just keep focusing on moving forward, and then your team will join in on that, and they will help you move forward. Um, That's the sort of overview of introduction to navigation. At this point, I'm going to open up to any questions, and we can bounce back to any parts. I know we went through it fairly quickly, but if you have any questions, please do shout. I see Mr. John Collins just joined. He's an exceptional navigator, so maybe you can also field some questions. But yeah, I'm going to open up to any questions, please. If it's not questions about navigating, you can also ask any questions potentially about adventure racing, about the event that we're organizing, the Mammoth Woodridge, any questions you may have. I'm just seeing lots of muted microphones. Surely there's some questions out there. Hello. Okay, so that's a good question. So staying in the map is it's challenging, So into and in every adventure racing team, again, I know there's first timers here. I know there's people that have raced a lot, and there's some people that are way more experienced than myself. Um, the trick is every single person on the team should know something about navigation. So don't take all the burden onto yourself. Everyone should ultimately try and take on a bit. And if you're navigating out loud and you're involving your team, okay, so although the final decision, and I didn't really talk about team structures to some of the newbies out there, but if you involve your teams, if you get to a point, and I do this often, I'll get to a point and I say, guys, I believe we're here now, so we can either it looks like a little path here. Let's maybe go forward. Let's whatever it may be. It's dark. It's raining. You're 100%. Involve them, try and include them in the decision, because that way if it's the wrong decision, at least you got more brains that can help you as the navigator make the correct decision. They won't be as grumpy to navigate back to a point that they 100% right will know where they are, and then try a different path. So teamwork is everything in adventure racing. So my answer to your question is involve your team. Obviously, if everyone starts getting tired and everyone's delirious, then at some point it's probably worth trying to take a bit of a nap. Obviously, if it's a 24-hour race, you're not really going to sleep. Then you just got to try and do your best. But I mean, we how does the saying go? It's not a matter of if you're going to get lost; it's a matter of when you get lost, how you deal with it. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Okay, Jane Bernardo, when do you get your map at an adventure race? Good question. So, it varies from race to race. most race directors might or no, might yeah, you might get your first map uh, either the evening before the race or the morning of the race. So, for example, if you're doing the 75K Woodridge race, you're going to get your first map on Friday night, and that'll be for the first leg 2 or 3. And then when you get to a transition zone, you will be given new maps. So the reason why a lot of people don't give all the maps up out front or in the beginning is because obviously while you still have technology around you, I suppose it's a bit of a gray area, but a lot of people go open up Google Earth with the map next to them and say, okay, well, this looks like a very tricky area. And then they'll try and see where the paths, where the roads, what's the best choice or option to make here. So ideally, you want everyone to have a level playing field. So you, it's quite common to get the maps at the last second just before you start racing. I know with some of the World Championship races, they literally hand the map out at the start. Any other questions, guys? Don't be shy. Hello, sir. Good on you. Awesome. Brutal. So, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to answer. I mean, ultimately, the cutoff time for the 200K is 40 hours. Your winning time will probably we're trying not to make it a sufferfest. Ideally, we want to try get people in up front. With that said, I don't think Heidi and Stefan were trying to make the Drakensberg a sufferfest, but the distance itself, gets challenging the longer you go in. I think the sleep deprivation is a real factor for going at one night completely without sleep and then going potentially into the second evening. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's the route. It's my first time doing a race like this, so I'm still going to sit with Stefan and go through it. But we're not, to answer your question, we're not trying to make it a sufferfest. We're trying to keep it, um, yeah, friendly to everyone. Yeah, me too. I'm buzzing. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. So I think we touched on a lot of those things you just mentioned, you know. So if you look where I've got there now, the declination lines are there, collecting those features. And obviously the darker it gets and the less visibility you have, the more you need to rely on your compass to make sure that you are going the correct direction. Obviously, guys like John are racing, so I don't even know how they do it at the pace they do it. We're going nice and slow, so the chance of us getting lost is slightly better. And then in terms of the scale, so I'm just going to hold my compass up here. I don't know if you can see it. You got that little magnifying glass. You'll be surprised how you can really see additional detail on the map. It's still pixels, but somehow it gives you a little bit more clarity when you're looking for specific features. So don't be shy to use that magnifying glass on your compass. No, 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 no. This is just what the advice for. Yeah, I suppose like again, you know, maybe for the 75K race, which is aimed at slightly more first timers, I might be kind enough to include the declination lines. But at the same time, I want people to get the full experience of navigation. So um, yeah, but I suppose declination lines isn't too big of a cheat. Obviously, they can mark their own CPs and pick their own routes. Cool, guys. Any other questions? A lot of people on the call. Lee, I know you said you might have a few questions about some of the ins and outs just about adventure racing. All your questions answered? Hmm. Absolutely. So the other thing that you can look for is what they call U's and V's. So generally speaking, your rivers because they're like eroding away. I'm trying to find good examples. Obviously, so you can see here, for example, like you just believe below the wilderness, those sort of shapes are a lot sharper. So it more closely resembles a V, where some of the other features, so your ridges and spurs will generally be they're not going to be as sharp. So those sharp V's, indicate water flowing down. I suppose they're going to be pointing uphill. Your U's are your spurs, and your ridges, they're going to be, I suppose, pointing downwards. But the best thing is just to look at the rivers. Look at the direction that the little rivers are flowing in. They're all flowing down into the valley. So generally, it starts with lots of littles going into one big. Um, so when I look at it, obviously I've looked at lots of maps. It's so obvious, but obviously the first time you do it, you need to get used to it, and that's where just getting out, taking a, and even I mean, even an area you know very well, take a map there because you know it well. It'll help you actually identify the 2D contour lines in the 3D space. Excellent question. So there's actually a website that's a good resource for it. I just want to quickly find it here. It's called SAGTA. Um, so it's maps.sagta.org.za that you can go and open up. I'll put the link quickly in the chat. Just want to grab it here. Um, where's my chat? Here it is. Okay. Um, so if you open this up, I'm just going to actually share a different screen here quickly.